Chapter 28. Le cimetière du Père Lachaise was established at the beginning of the 19th century on the hill of the old French and was named for Louis XIV's confessor, Father Lachaise. Now it was the resting place for legendary figures: Colette, Jim Morrison, Marcel Proust, Oscar Wilde, Sarah Bernhardt, Edith Piaf, Chopin, Balzac, Corot, Gertrude Stein, Modigliani, Stéphane Grappelli, Delacroix, Isadora Duncan, and so many others. Death styles of the rich and famous, Ambler mused as he entered. The cemetery was vast, well over 100 acres, and webbed with cobbled walkways. Especially in winter, it could resemble an arboretum of stone. He glanced at his watch. The meeting was to take place at 5:10. In Paris, during this time of the year, the sun set at around 5:30. Already the light was fading rapidly. He shivered, only partly because of the cold. You never agree to a rendezvous chosen by the other party. Basic protocol. But in this case he had no choice. He could not drop the thread. On the map, Père Lachaise was sectioned off into 97 divisions, like miniature counties. But the main routes had names, and the instructions had been quite specific about which to take. Carrying a black backpack, Ambler dutifully went from the Avenue Circulaire, the ring road along the outer periphery of the cemetery, to the Avenue de la Chapelle, and made a left on the Avenue Violante. All the roads and walkways, each lined with mausoleums and tombstones like little houses, made it seem like a village of the dead. Some of the tombs were in red granite, but most were carved slabs of pale limestone and travertine and marble. The grayness of the early evening added to the sepulchral air. He did not visit the specified rendezvous immediately. Instead, he walked the pathways surrounding it. The trees were plentiful, but largely leafless, of little use for concealment. Still, Fenton could have positioned security guards behind the larger edifices. They could also have been interspersed in plainclothes among the tourists and visitors, also plentiful. Ambler approached a nearby bench, a structure of green enameled steel slats, and, with a casual, inconspicuous motion, left a black backpack underneath it. He strolled away and took up an observation post across a diagonal path and behind one of the larger stone memorials. Then he ducked into a kiosk marked WC, removed his jacket, and put on a sweatshirt. He exited swiftly, stepping around the kiosk and behind a 10-foot stone memorial for one Gabriel Lully, where he could observe without being observed. A little over 60 seconds later, a denim-clad young man in a brown leather jacket and black t-shirt stumbled past, sat down on the bench and yawned, and then resumed a seemingly aimless walk. But as he walked away, Ambler could see that the backpack was gone. The young man with the leather jacket was one of the watchers and had done what Ambler had predicted, albeit with surprising fluidity and economy of movement. They had observed Ambler leaving the backpack in place and, intent on learning why, had dispatched someone to retrieve it. The item was, in fact, filled with birdseed. It was a play on a tradecraft term. Birdseed referred to anything of no actual value that might be used to attract the attention of enemy agents. They would understand the ruse as soon as the pack was opened and the bag of sunflower seeds and millet examined. Meanwhile, however, Ambler had identified one of the sentries, one of the watchers. He would follow the young man and see whether he led him to others. Walking down another cobbled path, Ambler was now wearing jeans, a gray sweatshirt, and horn-rimmed glasses with clear glass lenses. His other clothes were folded tightly in a small nylon zip bag he carried on a shoulder strap. He was utterly inconspicuous. Or so he hoped. He kept pace with the black-shirted watcher, 12 yards behind him, and to the left, and followed him through another square, a space where all manner of visitors, day trippers, tourists, art historians, even locals congregated. The young man with the leather jacket and the black t-shirt was walking with a studiedly casual saunter. He glanced to his left and to his right. Few people, however professional, would have registered the nearly imperceptible looks of recognition and acknowledgement from a large woman to his left and a small, weedy-looking man to his right. But Ambler did. They were watchers, too. Then Ambler stole another glance at the large woman. She had mouse-brown hair cut short and wore a lined denim jacket. Like many in the cemetery, she had a large pad of paper and a charcoal pastille, equipped to take rubbings of the tombstone inscriptions. Yet he could tell at a glance that she was faking it. Her eyes darted rapidly, attentive to her surroundings, but not to the carved stone before her. It was the same with the weedy-looking man, with his long dark hair combed in a part down the center. The ends looked greasy, almost matted. He, too, was a watcher. He had earphones on and bobbed his head as if to a beat. Ambler knew that the audio transmission he was listening to was anything but musical. Instructions could be transmitted to him at any time via a concealed radio device, and the woman with her mouse-brown hair would follow his lead. As Ambler proceeded to the next memorial square, the back of his neck began to tingle unpleasantly. There were more of them. He felt it as much as anything. It was in the gaze too intent on passers-by, the gaze too quickly averted, the ostensibly casual glance that lingered too long or ended too swiftly. It was in the fleeting exchange of glances between two people who were, from all appearances, of different walks of life, people who were or should have been unacquainted with each other. There was the sense of walking through a social organism, a seemingly unstructured collection of people who were connected by unseen strings, even as those strings were manipulated by an unseen puppet master. Ambler's skin began to crawl. He had not been surprised to find a small number of plainclothes security operatives. Some precautions would have been standard with a government official as senior as Undersecretary Whitfield was. But the configuration of personnel he had come across was all wrong for the sort of rendezvous he had been promised. There were far too many in place, for one thing. The netting was far too elaborate. People were situated in non-defensive positions, deployed as for rapid action. The patterns he was seeing were all too familiar to him. As a stab operative, he had sometimes had to set up such a deployment, invariably in preparation for aggressive actions, abduction, or assassination. Ambler's blood ran cold. He reeled in his mind, forcing himself to focus. Ahead of him, the man in the leather jacket and black t-shirt was passing the nylon backpack to two stone-faced men in dark woolen topcoats. They received the package and hurried off, no doubt towards some sort of containment vehicle. Two possibilities presented themselves. One was that the meeting had been compromised, that mutual enemies had learned of it and were organizing an interception. The second, and Ambler had to admit the more likely possibility, was that the rendezvous had been a setup from the beginning. Had Fenton been lying to him all along? Contemplating the prospect was a grievous blow to Ambler's sense of himself, but he could not rule out the possibility. Perhaps Fenton was a spectacular actor, the sort of method actor who had disciplined himself to experience the very emotions he displayed. Ambler's power of affective perception may have been, as a life's experience suggested, unusual and uncanny. He had no illusions they were infallible. He was not incapable of being fooled. Perhaps so Fenton himself had been misinformed. That seemed a likelier prospect. It would have been vastly easier to lie to Fenton than it would have been to lie to him. Whatever the circumstances were, Ambler knew that an immediate retreat was the only safe move. It pained him. Any member of the team that had been mobilized here might know something that Ambler needed to know. Every enemy was a potential source, yet knowledge could do him no good if he was dead. He had at least to accept that truth. Ambler quickened his stride and took an immediate right. It would lead him to the Pere-Lachaise metro station. Now, on the straight, cobbled pathway, he strode even faster, like a businessman who had realized he was going to be late for a meeting. He saw what was happening to him too late. The two bulky men who had received the backpack, both dressed in similar dark topcoats, were closing in on him from opposite directions and now stepping into him, their broad shoulders catching Ambler's, spinning him around in a fluid, well-choreographed movement. Je m'excuse, they kept repeating loudly. A bystander would have made nothing of it, a minor collision among hurrying, distracted businessmen. Meanwhile, Ambler thrashed furiously and in vain. The two operatives were tall and broad, taller and broader than Ambler, and their enrobed bulk helped conceal the disciplined ferocity with which they propelled Ambler off the cobblestone and toward the back of an adjoining mausoleum. Moments later, concealed from view by an elaborate stone edifice, they stood to either side, hands gripping his upper arms, immobilizing him. The man on his right had an object in his other hand, a thing of plastic and a small glimmer of steel. A hypodermic, in fact, with an amber fluid visible in the calibrated tube. "Not one word," the man said in a hushed voice, "or I sink this in your arm." He was an American, stocky-framed and broad-faced, and his breath had the bouillon stink of a bodybuilder's all-protein diet. Now a third man sprang into view, and it was a few seconds before Ambler recognized him. His hair was curly, thinning, graying. His eyes were narrow-set, his forehead deeply creased. When Ambler knew him, his face was smooth, his head of hair full and unruly. Unchanged was his long, straight, broad nose and flaring nostrils, which gave his face a certain equine cast. There was no mistaking the man he had known as Cronus. Now Cronus smiled, a smile so devoid of warmth as to be a beacon of menace. "It has been a while, hasn't it?" he said, in a conversational tone that was anything but conversational in intent. "Too long, Tarquin." "Maybe not long enough," Ambler replied neutrally. His eyes flickered among all three men. Already it was obvious that Cronus was the figure of authority here. The others were looking to him for a signal to act. 10 years ago I gave you a gift. Now I'm afraid I'll have to take it back. Does that make me an Indian giver?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Cronus's eyes gleamed with pure hatred. "Though it's an odd expression, don't you think?" Ambler needed more time to figure out the situation he was in. "Odd, I mean that we talk about Indian giving. When you think about all those hundreds of treaties the white man made with the red man, all those promises and guarantees, all of which were broken, you'd think the expression should be Indian taker, meaning to accept something that will only be taken back. Wouldn't that make more sense?" Cronus looked at him. "Did you really think you could get away with it?" "With what?" "You miserable fuck." The words came out in a quiet explosion. "Killing a great man doesn't make you any less insignificant. You're still a worm, and you'll be stepped on like a worm." Ambler peered into the black depths of Cronus's eyes. Rage glinted there, but something else did too. Sorrow, grief. "Cronus, what happened?" Ambler said softly, intently. "You murdered Paul Fenton," Cronus said. "The question is why?" "Fenton dead?" Ambler's mind began to cycle rapidly. "Listen to me, Cronus," he began. "You're making a big mistake." This whole rendezvous he saw now had never been anything other than a death trap. The revenge plotted by a faithful lieutenant half crazed with grief. "No, goddammit, you listen to me," Cronus said, cutting him off. "You'll tell me what I want to know. I'll find out the hard way or the easy way, and I'm kind of hoping it'll be the hard way." Vengeful sadism funneled and twisted his face into a dark scowl. The grand four-column tomb of the Napoleonic general and statesman Maximilien Sebastian Foy had a massive base and a finely wrought statue of its inhabitant. For Jolie's purposes, however, its main point of attraction was the pitched stone roof above the pediment and entablature. Resting on the roof, concealed from view by the decorative parapet, Jolie stretched like a cat and gazed through his binoculars. The view was extensive. The tomb was one of the highest elevations in the immediate vicinity, and the season had turned many of the trees and bushes into leafless skeletons. His rifle, a modified version of the QBZ-95 sniper rifle, was of Chinese design and manufacture. The 5.8 by 42 millimeter ammunition it chambered was a kind exclusively made for China's Special Operations Forces. The Norinco model, developed by China North Industries Corporation, had been not merely reverse engineered from Russian prototypes, but improved in the process. The bullets had greater penetration power, retained their energy over a longer portion of their trajectory. Jolie himself had further modified the rifle to make it more mobile, easier to collapse and conceal. Through his powerful binoculars, he studied the tight knot of men around Tarquin. Tarquin had demonstrated a remarkable ability to escape difficult situations with professional dispassion. Jolie had to grant him that, but he was mortal, only flesh and blood. In all likelihood, there would be a great deal of both flesh and blood on display, and before the sun had set. Jolie's last communication with Beijing had been unsatisfactory. His controller was growing impatient. In the past, Jolie had always achieved results with considerable dispatch. He was not used to having to explain delays. He was even less accustomed to the sorts of complications that his assignment had presented him with. But Jolie was not mere muscle executing the commands of another. He had a head of his own. He collected and purveyed information. He had a highly developed faculty of judgment. He was no mere shasho, no mere triggerman. Tarquin was too formidable a target for a mere target shooter, and the stakes were too great to allow mistakes. And yet the meaning of success in this assignment was proving to be less straightforward than Jolie had first supposed. He peered through the scope again, the focus electronically perfected to maximal sharpness at the precise point where the crosshairs met. Just curious, how many associates do you have here? Ambler asked. A baker's dozen, Cronus replied. Reticular placement, Ambler said, partly to himself. It was a standard configuration at Stab, one with which both he and Cronus had plenty of experience. Each operative had a connection, either visual, auditory, or electronic, with at least two others. A small number of operatives had a connection with a distant unit. The redundant pathways ensured a coordinated response even if any of the participants were taken out of action. The old-fashioned top-down command and control structure had proven vulnerable to decapitation. The reticular system made that impossible. Not bad for something so last minute, Ambler said, genuinely impressed. The Strategic Services Group has resources everywhere, Cronus said. Benton's legacy. We'd all give our lives for him. That's what people like you could never grasp. People like me. Carefully, casually, Ambler took a step back. His best chance of escape was to be the apex of a triangle, to get the other three to align themselves into a single level. He composed his face into an expression of resignation and glanced at the man to his left. The man was looking at Cronus, getting his signals from the leader. Cronus's very authority would have to be used against him. Now Ambler started speaking heatedly, testily, the sort of verbal protest that was normally inconsistent with physical aggression. You're making a lot of assumptions, Cronus. You always did. You're wrong about Fenton, but you're too blind or too stupid to admit your mistake. Biggest mistake I ever made was saving your life back in Vani. He was referring to the region in northern Sri Lanka that was a heartland of the Tamil Tigers, the LTTE terrorists. You think you saved my life? That what you think? You almost got me killed, you goddamn cowboy. Bullshit, Cronus spoke in a low voice, but his indignation was audible. The meet was a setup. There were half a dozen Tamil tigers present, armed to kill you, Tarquin. Ambler remembered the scene well. After many weeks of negotiations, he had finally arranged a meeting with select members of the so-called Black Tigers, guerrillas who had pledged to be suicide bombers, a technique that the Tamils had pioneered. Tarquin believed that a hiving off of factions could be engineered, much as happened with Sinn Féin, that the die-hard terrorists could eventually be isolated from the broader civil struggle. The particular rebel leader he was meeting with, Arvalon, had come to recognize the futility of terror. He and his circle thought they could bring others along with them, so long as certain resources were made available to them. Tarquin thought he knew a way to assist with that. Cronus was part of a small backup team that Tarquin's superiors at the Political Stabilization Unit had insisted on. Tarquin's combat vest was equipped with a fiber optic microphone system that would provide them an auditory feed. Several minutes into the meeting, as Tarquin expected, Arvalon started to berate the American. An eavesdropper ignorant of the situation might have thought that Tarquin was being threatened, but Tarquin could see from the man's oddly immobile expression that he was merely putting on an act for the sake of his associates. Those were his lines. Tarquin knew his. Then suddenly the thatched door to the jungle hut was pushed open, and Cronus barged in, his automatic weapon on full fire. Another assault rifle, wielded by someone under Cronus's direct command, was jammed through the opposite doorway, blasting away at the assembled LTTE officials. Within a few seconds, the bloodshed was complete. Arvalon and most of his circle lay dead. One member of his retinue had escaped through the jungle. Tarquin had been livid. All his efforts had been destroyed by the actions of one headstrong, heedless stab operative. In fact, it was worse than undone. Word of the massacre would spread swiftly among the LTTE. The prospects for any further Western mediation or intervention had now dimmed precipitously. No tiger would ever agree to such a meeting again. The consequences were now all too clear. Yet there Cronus stood among the carnage, glowing with pride and smirkily declining what he imagined to be Tarquin's gratitude. Afterward, Tarquin did something he rarely did. He cabled Whitfield and, explaining what had happened, told her that Cronus was a menace, someone who had to be removed from the field immediately, forcibly retired. Whitfield had instead relegated Cronus to a desk job among the analysts on the grounds that his considerable experience in the field was too valuable simply to throw away. Tarquin understood the rationale, but he never forgave Cronus his blunderbuss impulses and self-satisfied manner. "You were too full of yourself to know what the hell you did back there in Jaffna," Tarquin said. "You were a goddamn menace. That's why they took you out of the field." "You're demented," Cronus said. "I should have left you to die in the tiger's den. Like I said, my bad, but it won't happen twice." "You think you saved my ass. The truth is, you nearly got me killed, and you destroyed an entire operation while you were at it. If it wouldn't have jeopardized operational clandestinity, you would have faced judicial proceedings, and these poor guys are taking orders from you." The trick, Tarquin knew, was to keep talking even as he attacked. "You think you earned," Tarquin fluidly swiveled back, "my gratitude? That just goes to show." Now, with explosive force, he slammed a spearhand into the throat of the square-jawed giant to his left. "How oblivious you are." Despite the exertion, Tarquin did his best to maintain an ordinary speaking tone. The mismatch between his voice and his actions would confuse his assailants, gaining him a crucial few moments. He could feel the impact of his knuckles against cartilage. The damaged tissue surrounding the trachea would start to constrict his airway, but in the meantime, Tarquin would need to use the stricken man as a shield against the other two. Even as the syringe dropped to the ground, Tarquin lashed out at the other muscle man, but the man dodged the blow and reached into his jacket for a handgun. A second blow to the temple landed, and the impact shot a bolt of pain through Tarquin's arm. Even so, the man was only temporarily stunned. Now he and Cronus dived out of the way, racing in opposite directions. A reprieve that was no reprieve at all, Tarquin realized. It meant that he was in the field of fire. As Tarquin dived to the ground, he heard 4 muted reports. From where? And marble and dirt exploded all around him. He forced himself to survey the terrain opposite and saw a mound of dense rhododendrons, their heavy leathery leaves immune to the cold, and fleetingly a glimpse of a hunched khaki-clad shoulder. Time slowed. He yanked the long-barreled pistol from the downed man's shoulder holster, took careful aim, and fired a tight, rapid cluster of 3 shots. He was surprised at the quiet spitting sound that came from the gun, and realized that what he had taken to be a long-barreled pistol was, in fact, a Beretta 92 Centurion, a compact 9mm with a shortened slide-in barrel. A silencer was what had elongated the barrel. Now, from the rhododendron hedge, he saw a bloodied arm flail into the air, and moments later, a wounded man lurched from the foliage to the safety of adjoining statuary. Yet there was no safety for Tarquin. He had to move. Every moment at rest was a moment he was in someone's crosshairs. He sprang off in the direction where Cronus had run, felt the stinging spray of marble against his ear. Another bullet had been aimed at him, this one he sensed from a sniper operating from an elevated location. Tarquin glanced around him as he ran. There were all too many places where such a sniper could be secreted. A baker's dozen, Cronus had said, and he had not been bluffing. All were seasoned killers, all programmed to take Tarquin down. He needed to shift the odds. He needed to use the peculiarity of the terrain against them. But how? He was way past the irony of having to fight for his life on the grounds of a cemetery. Pere Lachaise was more than that. It was a giant game board, a fretwork of paths and lanes and monuments that could serve as obstacles or as points of attack. His enemies were arrayed in a network upon a network. He needed to gain access to that network. Racing from one tomb to another, he was attracting less attention than he would have expected. He had to think, no, he had to feel, to let his instincts guide him. How would he have arranged the team if it were up to him? He'd have some of the SSG team in offensive positions, others merely taking up observation posts to be deployed offensively only as a last resort. He had to use his peculiar skills, his comparative advantage in his own defense, or he would die here, and he had come too far for that. Overwhelming his fear was the one emotion that was even more powerful: rage. He felt rage at what had been done to him, starting in Changhua. Rage at the attempt to rob him of his very soul in the sterile environs of Parish Island. Rage at the arrogance of these strategists who deployed human beings like so many pawns on a chessboard of geopolitics. He would not die here, not now, not tonight. Others would die. For those who would kill him would be shown no mercy. He raced down a lane signpost, Chemin du Quinconce, over an area of sodden turf to another cobbled walkway, the Avenue Aguado. He was now nearing the northwestern section of the vast cemetery, approaching a large chapel in a Moorish style with a round dome over a huge portico. In fact, it was a columbarium, a building erected to house cinerary urns. In front of the main entrance was a deep staircase leading to an open subterranean vault, like a dark rectangular chasm. Here was a place of refuge that could equally serve as a lethal snare. It was impossible that the SSG team would have left it unattended. Perhaps 60 feet away was what looked like a semi-enclosed arcade, a pillared walkway of limestone and slate. Tarquin darted into it, his eyes swiveling rapidly. To his left, he saw a Japanese man with a pocket-sized digital camera and a malevolent gaze. Tarquin did not give him a second thought. The tourist was annoyed because Tarquin had just ruined his shot. A young blonde woman and an older man, olive-skinned and graying at the temples, were standing in the next alcove, in something less than a full embrace. She was gazing soulfully at him while his eyes darted toward Tarquin anxiously. Yet it was not the anxiety of someone determined to see. It was the anxiety of someone determined not to be seen. Perhaps the man was cheating on his wife, or, this being France, cheating on his mistress, worse still. The adjoining pair of alcoves was vacant. In the next one, a broad-faced woman was reading what looked like a book of poetry. She glanced up at Tarquin briefly, registering no obvious interest, and returned to her reading. It was a ruse that would have been more persuasive 10 or 15 minutes ago when the light was still adequate to read comfortably. The woman had her broad masculine face, and her thick legs were planted with a bend in the knee. In the manner of a trained operative. He saw her slip a hand into her nylon parka as if for warmth. Any doubts Tarquin might have had vanished. For the moment, however, he could not reveal that he knew. Instead, he deliberately kept his gaze straight ahead as he turned into her alcove. He moved as if he had noticed something through the bay and was straining to see. As he passed her, he suddenly veered, crashing his body into hers, and the two of them tumbled heavily to the stone flooring. He twisted her body as they fell and thrust the muzzle of the silent Beretta against her throat. "Not one word," he said. "Fuck you," she hissed, drawing in breath through her clenched teeth. Another native speaker, then. Her broad face was distended like that of a snake preparing to strike. He rammed his knee into her stomach, and she gasped. There was fury on her face, much of it directed toward herself, toward her own failure to have anticipated his move. Tarquin grabbed her book, Le Fleur du Mal, the cover said in maroon type, and opened it. As he expected, a miniaturized radio transmitter was lodged in a rectangular space carved out of the pages. "Tell them you have seen me," Tarquin whispered. "Tell them I have ducked into the underground vault of the columbarium here." Uncertainty flicked in her eyes, and he pressed ahead. "Otherwise, I will leave your corpse there to join the others." He jammed the muzzle of the Beretta harder against her throat, and he saw her break. "You try anything, I'll know," he warned her. Pressing a button on the transmitter, she said, Constellation 87. The cemetery was divided into 90-some areas. The chapel was in the middle of Division 87. Tarquin was relieved that she did not identify herself as 87A or 87E, a complication that would mean others too had been positioned in his division. He grabbed the small wireless earbud in her right ear and placed the flesh-colored piece of plastic in his own. "What's your report?" The metallic voice crackled through the earbud. He nodded to the woman. "He's hiding in the underground vault," she said. He whispered into her ear, "And he's armed." "And he's armed," she added. They already knew that. Her volunteering the detail would make it even more likely that her report would be credible. Now he yanked down the woman's nylon coat, trapping her arms. A loud voice from the central walkway. "Mademoiselle, is that guy bothering you?" A well-meaning question from an uninvolved passerby. Tarquin stole a quick glance at the man. He was thin, gangly, with an officious expression and a scholarly air. A student at a local university, perhaps. Impressions were formed in a split second, Tarquin knew, and could be erased in another. He pressed his face to the woman operative, mashing his mouth against hers. "My darling," he called out in English, "so the answer is yes. You'll marry me? You've made me the happiest man." He pitched his voice in the tones of exultation and joy, clutching her passionately. It did not matter whether the Frenchman spoke English. The import would be clear enough. "Excusez-moi," the man said quietly, reddening and turning on his heel. Tarquin wiped his mouth on his sleeve and turned to what looked like a small tool case clipped to her belt. He unhooked it, knocking away her hands as she grabbed for it. He recognized it as at once a klein Maschinen pistol, a folding machine gun known as the businessman's subgun. The deadly device was based on a stamped metal weapon developed by the KGB Design Bureau in Tula, the PP-90, and could discharge its entire load in a near instantaneous burst, like a death ray of lead. It was a marvel of miniaturization. The trigger guard was hinged. A spring-loaded catch controlled the folding of the weapon. It was just 10.5 inches with a magazine that held 30 rounds of 9mm parabellums. On a corner of the metal oblong object was a spring-loaded button. When Tarquin pressed it, one part of the metal case swung to the rear and became a buttstock. Then, without warning, he whipped his arm back against her neck and forced her head forward into the crushing vise. She would be unconscious for several minutes. He propped her body on the marble bench, letting her head loll back against the wall as if she were napping. Now he removed her shoelaces and made a loop that encircled her left ankle, ran twice around the steel unguarded trigger of the subgun, and then around both wrists. As soon as she attempted to stand or straighten herself, the loop would tauten. He moved to another alcove a few hundred feet away that was now darkly shadowed, but permitted a view of the steps that led down to the columbarium. He did not have long to wait. The first on the scene was the same leather-jacketed youth who had retrieved his backpack. Now he was racing down the steps into the columbarium, a hand inside his jacket, as if clutching his stomach. A bald, middle-aged man with a pitted face and a large belly was next on the scene. He did not descend, but rather stationed himself near the chapel, at the far end of the staircase. He could look down and see the landing below, a sensible backup position. A third man arrived 2 minutes later. It was the second of the two men who had grabbed Tarquin as he tried to leave the cemetery. His face was reddened and glazed with sweat from anxiety or the physical exertion of running, or both. Tarquin heard a low tone from the small rubberized earbud, and then the metallic voice again. Constellation 87, confirmed subject remains in position. Tarquin, his eyes peeled on the sweat-slicked man, saw that his lips were moving as the voice was transmitted. Obviously, it was his voice transmitted by means of a hidden fiber optic lip mic. A look of perplexity traveled across his face. Constellation 87, come in, he said. Tarquin leveled the silent Beretta on the stone ledge of the nearest bay, peering through the deepening gloom with a sinking feeling. Even if he had been a champion shooter, and he was not, the distance was too great for an accurate hit using a handgun. The odds were greater that he would give his own position away than that he would bring down a member of the assault team. He waited for one more member of the team to appear in Division 87. That was almost half of them now, and then stealthily made his retreat, sliding through a low bay and then through a bramble-ridden area of the quadrant to his north. He could see a guardhouse, the large map for tourists, the tall, dark green gates that led on to the city proper. If he squinted, he could see the faded green and white awnings of a Paris street. Its seeming proximity was deceptive. From a distance, he heard a clattering burst of automatic fire and startled shrieks of alarm. The poetry lover had roused herself. The 30 rounds would have been harmlessly discharged into the stone depression beneath the marble bench. To the operatives in the area, however, it would act as a homing beacon, drawing them toward an apse-like space he had long abandoned. Moving faster, he hurried past countless tombs and statues, leafless trees, and rustling evergreen bushes, even as shadows lengthened and the setting sun's rosy glow began to ebb like an expiring flame. His muscles were coiled, his senses on full alert. His ploy had, in the tradecraft jargon, quote-unquote, reduced the pressure of the hostile forces. Yet others would remain in position, scouting the terrain with binoculars. The danger was especially acute at the points of egress, such as the one he was approaching. It would be natural to place sentries at such locations. He put on another burst of speed. He stumbled briefly on the uneven ground, cursing inwardly, and then he felt, rather than heard, the double tap. Another spray of stone, sharp, stinging fragments. Had his stride been steady, had he not stumbled, one of those bullets would have struck him in the upper body. Tarquin rolled to the ground and ducked around a 6-foot-tall obelisk. Where was the shooter? Again, there were too many possibilities. Another silent spray of stone, this time from the opposite side, the side where he had sought refuge. Where was safety? He whipped his head around. Given the obstacles that surrounded him, the angle of the shot was too low to have come from any distance. "Stand up like a man, why don't you?" Cronus's voice. The burly operative stepped out of a shadowed space behind a large memorial stone. Tarquin desperately scanned the area in front of him. He saw the back of an oblivious green uniformed maintenance worker, Paralaches equipped entretien, stenciled in white along the shoulder area and on the back of the visored cap. Through the tall green gates, so close and yet a million miles away, it seemed, Tarquin could hear the faint bustle of a Paris street in the evening, a thinning array of tourists. The light was too dim to take good photographs, were unaware of the lethal game of possum that was in progress. Cronus's pistol was trained on him. Tarquin could try to grab for his Beretta, yet the long silenced muzzle would add a fatal split second to the time needed to remove and deploy it. All around him, the business of everyday life proceeded as usual. The groundskeeper or sanitation worker, or whatever he was, kept at his trash picker, his face shadowed behind the visored cap. The tourists started to flow through the gates, looking for taxis or figuring out where the metro station was, chatting among themselves in jaded end-of-day voices. Cronus signaled to someone across the way, the sniper, Tarquin inferred. "Don't worry about our marksman friend," Cronus said in a voice of freezing malevolence. "He's just playing backstop. The kill is mine. Everyone knows that." The sanitation man was steadily working his way along the ground, moving closer, and Tarquin found himself worrying that his movement could be restricted by his presence. The groundsman was uninvolved, a bystander, though Tarquin very much doubted whether the distinction made much of an impression on the likes of Cronus. For a moment, Tarquin had a hovering sense of danger, something about the way the man walked. Suddenly, a shaft of light from the setting sun dazzled off the windshield of a passing car, and for an instant the groundsman's face was illuminated. Tarquin felt another jolt of terror. He remembered the plaza swimming pool, the face he glimpsed at the Luxembourg Gardens, the Chinese assassin. His odds of survival had plummeted further. "The thing you'll never understand, Cronus," said Tarquin, desperately trying to buy time, "is that I've heard enough out of you," the burly man said, his finger curling around the silenced pistol. Abruptly, the expression of hostility left his face, replaced by an oddly vacant look. At that same instant, Tarquin became aware of a plume of red droplets that had erupted from Cronus's left ear. The Chinese man had dropped to one knee, the trash picker in his hands, replaced by a long, silenced rifle. It had happened so rapidly that Tarquin could only make sense of the events retrospectively. The Chinese man whirled around toward Tarquin and squeezed off a shot, and for a moment Tarquin wondered whether this was the last thing he would ever see, except that the man was peering through the scope, and a professional did not peer through a scope to fire at a target 15 feet away. Tarquin heard the plink of an ejected cartridge. The assassin was not firing at him, but at the sniper. Tarquin's mind reeled. It made no sense. The man before him aimed his rifle again, peering through the scope. Only someone extraordinarily skilled would attempt to hit a concealed sniper from a free-form firing position, matching the stability of a bipod with the frame of a squatting human being. A double tap, 2 plinks, 2 more cartridges ejected. From some distance, Tarquin heard a moan of an injured man. The green uniformed marksman rose from his crouching position and folded the stock of his rifle. Tarquin was dumbfounded, dazed with incomprehension and disbelief. The assassin was letting him live. I don't understand, Tarquin said to him numbly. He turned to Tarquin, his brown eyes solemn. I know that now. It is why you are still alive. Tarquin looked at him anew and saw a man who was doing what he believed duty demanded. A man who took pride in his formidable skills, but no pleasure in their deadly consequences. The man was, in his sense of himself, not so much a warrior as a guardian. He knew that throughout human history there had always been men like him, whether praetorian prefect, knight templar, or samurai, who turned themselves into implements of steel so that others would not need to. Men who were hard so that others could be soft. Men who killed so that others could live safely. Protection was his watchword. Protection was his creed. A split second later, the Chinese man's throat exploded into a cloud of blood. The unseen sniper, however badly wounded, had at least one more shot in him, and he had trained it on the man who posed the greatest threat to him. Tarquin sprang to his feet. For a brief interval, and only for a brief interval, the other assailants would be a safe distance away, impeded by the stones and sepulchres of this garden of death. He had to seize the opportunity, or lose it forever. He charged toward the double green gates adjoining the street, not stopping until he found the rental car he had left on a nearby block. As he veered through the clamorous Paris traffic, taking pains to be sure that he had not been followed, he tried to process what he had learned. The elements jostled and collided, tearing at his consciousness. Someone had killed Fenton. Was it a member of Fenton's organization, a mole of some sort? Was it someone Fenton worked with, someone in the United States government? And the Chinese assassin, an adversary who had become an ally, indeed someone who had given up his life to protect Ambler. Why? Who was he working for? There were too many possibilities, too many impossibilities that had become possibilities. Tarquin, no, he had to become Ambler now, had reached a point where conjecture could be actively misleading. Something else too frightened him. The wash of adrenaline had not been a wholly unpleasant sensation. What kind of man was he, after all? He shuddered, contemplating his own character. He had killed and nearly been killed this evening. Why, then, did he feel so alive? I don't understand, Laurel repeated. All three of them were gathered in Andrew's oatmeal bland hotel room. I don't either, Ambler said. None of this feels right. It doesn't add up, Caston put in. Wait a minute, Laurel said. You said the killings were all linked to China. You said it looked like a progression, a sequence, like it was leading up to something imminent. You figured that Liu Eng was the probable target. He's supposed to be visiting the White House next month, Caston said. Big history-making thing with dinners of state and all that. Plenty of opportunities, but what? Timing seems wrong. There's too much of a delay, given the previous specifications of event density. There is no delay, Laurel said. She opened her large handbag and pulled out a furled copy of the International Herald Tribune. Something you were saying about that Le Monde story made me think of it. Come again? Tomorrow night, Laurel said, President Liu Eng's big night. What are you talking about? Ambler said. I'm talking about the World Economic Forum, she said. I'm talking about what's happening in Davos this week. Ambler began to pace as he thought out loud. Liu Eng leaves the security of the Beijing cocoon for the first time since taking office. He comes to the West, makes his big speech designed to make everybody feel warm and fuzzy toward the great tiger. Palmer couldn't have put it better himself, Caston said acerbically, in the midst of which he's gunned down. Removed from the equation, Caston looked contemplative. But by whom? Ben's voice. Got a real exciting project for you coming up, but don't pack your skis just yet. Ambler did not speak for a long moment. Could Fenton have thought I would do it? Is that possible? Here's the thing. I've been wrapping my mind around Fenton's death. To me, that killing is evidence of something. It's exactly the kind of loose end that you snip off when an operation is about to reach a climax. You speak so bloodlessly, Caston said. You sure you've never been an accountant? Chalk it up to a career spent in the service of the Political Stabilization Unit, Ambler said. That's an important signpost. Another is that the assassin may well be someone I know, someone I worked with on a previous stab operation. That makes no sense, Laurel said. Stab prided itself on hiring the best of the best. Fenton prided himself on hiring the best of Stab. If you were entrusting someone with the assassination of the Chinese president, wouldn't you get the best trained person you could? And if it were a Stab operative, Laurel said slowly, the odds are that you'd have had some dealings with the person. Absolutely, Ambler said. Well, fuck it up, Caston said. Do either of you have any idea what we're looking at? If it's Davos, then we're too late. We've got to figure out what happens after, Caston said glumly. Because the consequences, my God, the consequences. President Liu Eng is an incredibly beloved figure in China. He's like JFK and the Pope and John Lennon all wrapped into one. When he's killed, a country of 1.4 billion people is going to be roiled by outrage. I mean, goddamn keening hysteria of the kind that'll deafen you halfway around the globe. And that hysteria is going to turn into wrath in a heartbeat if anything, and I mean anything, should connect the assassination to members of the U.S. government. Do you have any idea what kind of safety valve you need for 1.4 billion outraged citizens? It could plunge the nations into war, okay? The belligerents could take over Zhongnanhai overnight. To risk that, you'd have to be a fanatic, Laurel said. Like Ashton Palmer and his disciples, Ambler felt the blood drain from his face. Laura looked off in the middle distance as she repeated the words that once expressed Ambler's youthful yearnings. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Damn it, it's not over until it's over, Ambler said. Fury surged into his voice. I'm not going to let them get away with this. Now Caston leaped from his chair and started to walk back and forth. They'll have thought this through from every angle. Who knows how long they've been working on this? An operation like this, there will be a deep cover agent in place, and a backup too. I've audited enough operations to know that operational redundancies are standard. An operation like this has got to have a hidden fail-safe mechanism, a call-off code, and some strategy of misdirection. There's always got to be a fall guy. His gaze sharpened. It would simplify matters if that was also the gunman, of course. But we've got to assume that they've done a thorough assessment of the parameters, all the parameters. An operation always involves human beings, Ambler said, a hint of defiance in his voice. And human beings never quite behave like integers in a matrix, Caston. You can't quantify the human factor, not with any precision. That's what people like you never understand. And what people like you never understand is that, guys, Laurel interjected impatiently, tapping on the newspaper. Guys, it says here that he's speaking at Davos at 5 tomorrow afternoon. That's less than 24 hours from now. Oh, dear Christ, Ambler breathed. Laurel's eyes shifted from Ambler to Caston and back again. Can't we just alert everyone? Trust me, they're already operating on top alert, Ambler said. That's how they do business. The trouble is there have been so many death threats against this guy that there's a serious boy who cried wolf problem at this point. They know about the threats. There's nothing new there. And Liu Eng refuses to be immobilized by them. Laura looked bewildered, desperate. Can you explain that this time the threat's really, really serious? Caston shot her a glance. I'll do that, he said. I'm sure it'll make all the difference. Now he turned to Ambler. You really think there's a chance you'd recognize the assassin? Yes, Ambler said simply. I think they'd meant to recruit me for the job. But you're right, of course. Fenton doesn't work without a backstop. An understudy has the job now, and he's bound to be from the same talent pool. For a while, the three were silent. Even if he wasn't, Laurel said hesitantly, you'd still be able to pick up on him. You've done it before. You have the gift of seeing. That gift of seeing. I've done it before, Ambler acknowledged. It's just that the stakes were never nearly this high. Still, what choice is there? Laura flushed. You don't owe anyone anything, Hal, she said, suddenly agitated. Don't be a hero. Let's just disappear, all right? Is that what you really want? Yes, she said, and then she murmured no. Tears welled up in her eyes. I don't know, she said in a muffled voice. All I know is if that's where you're going, that's where I'm going. There's no other place I feel safe. You know that. Ambler pulled her close, pressed his forehead to hers, and squeezed her tightly. Okay, he whispered, and he did not know whether the catch in his voice was of laughter or sorrow. Okay. After a while, Caston turned around. You have any idea how you might accomplish this? Sure, Ambler said, his voice hollow. Caston sat down in the mustard-colored armchair and looked at Ambler stonily. Just so you're clear about this, you've got less than 24 hours to elude whatever lethal operative strategic services and or your own beloved consular operations have on the lookout, make your way into Switzerland, infiltrate a heavily guarded conclave of the global elite, and identify the assassin before he strikes. Ambler nodded. Well, let me tell you something, Caston arched an eyebrow. It's not going to be as easy as it sounds.